Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Maselli. I'm a media officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar for our recently released report, Building Resilience into the Nation's Medical Product Supply Chains. And for those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. For each requested study, our committee members are chosen for their expertise and experience, and they serve pro bono to carry out the study statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the entire committee, and they must undergo external peer review before they're released, as did this report. We have here with us several members of the committee to discuss the report, and we'll start off with an overview of the report findings and recommendations. Then we'll open it up for the audience Q&A. Before we delve into that, just a few reminders. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We'll start with that presentation, then audience Q&A. And if you are going to submit a question, you can simply click that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical questions during this webinar, you can contact Zoom tech support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. And now I'll introduce our panelists with us. We have Lee Brandstetter with Carnegie Mellon University. We have Özlem Ergün with the Department of Industrial and Mechanical Engineering at Northeastern University. We have Aaron Fox with the Department of Pharmacy Services at University of Utah Health. And we have Craig Vanderwagen of East West Protection, LLC. It's a former Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you all for attending today. We think we're going to offer you an set of insights that will be very useful. And we believe that there are elements of this that will be transformative in the way we understand the medical product supply chain. Kelsey, next slide, please. So our study sponsor was the HHS Office of the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response. Next slide. Our committee membership had a wide range of skill sets, from academic research into the areas of supply chain management, disruption, et cetera, to clinicians at the ground level who actually are the end users out there at the supply chain level with their patients. You will note that 3 of our members had to resign during the course of this committee. 2 of them went into government, and one of those was the recently confirmed commissioner for FDA. Next, please. So our statement of task, next. The CARES Act was passed, and included in that was the recognition that disasters and emergencies have exposed the fragility in our supply chain, and that there is a need to explore policy and regulatory and system solutions to prevent and mitigate the impacts of shortages on our public health, national security, and patient care. Section 3101 specified that the HHS Secretary was to enter into an agreement with the National Academies to establish a committee to examine these issues, and ASPR became the sponsor. Next. So the charge to the committee was to assess and evaluate the dependence of the United States on critical drugs and devices that are sourced or manufactured outside of the United States. Now, we'll define critical drugs and devices as we go forward, because that's a critical understanding that we need to bring to the fore. We were asked to provide recommendations to improve the resiliency of the supply chain for these drugs and devices. And resiliency, in our mind, is the right drug to the right person at the right time. I should say right product, because devices are part of that picture as well. So we were asked to look at those things that would pose a threat to our health security, and that would include promoting supply chain redundancy and effective contingency planning, that we could encourage domestic manufacturing, including consideration of the impacts economically of attempting that process, improving the supply chain information gaps, planning considerations, and promoting greater accessibility of drugs and devices. Next. So our approach was to look at the current and relevant literature that would expose to us how that supply chain exists, functions, the potential flaws and failures that may occur. We also conducted 5 virtual whole of committee meetings and numerous monthly subcommittee meeting calls between September 2020 and October of 2021. It was critically important to the committee to have input from not only the producers, manufacturers, and distributors of these drugs and products, but to also approach the question of how is that impacting people at the end of that supply chain, namely patients and the clinicians that are providing care for those people. The security of America's medical product supply chain proceedings of a workshop is available to you, which will summarize that set of discussions. Next, please. The report is organized first in part 1 with what I think is a very effective monograph that describes how we can understand the medical product supply chain, what factors contribute to globalization of that supply chain, and the causes and consequences of supply chain failure. Part 2 really gets to how we recommend this issue should be addressed, and it begins with a framework for how we can create a resilient supply chain. Then we have recommendations specifically addressing awareness, mitigation, preparedness, and response concerns in this area of activity. Next, please. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Ergun to help us understand this complex supply chain, some features of globalization, and some identifiable potential flaws and faults. And she will also describe for you our framework approach to this process. Özlem? Özlem, are you having audio problems? Yes, the technical challenges of virtual activity.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Oh,
thank you.
I don't know what happened. I was unmuted, but I didn't. Okay, thank you. Good morning. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we would like to recognize is the fact that medical product supply chains are complex, multi-stage global systems that involve people, processes, technologies, and policies. So these supply chains facilitate the flow of raw materials and components all the way from the suppliers to producers to distributors to providers and to the patients. And along the way, at each stage, the supply chain is made up of different stakeholders and different people and organizations. And the behavior of these stakeholders, organizations, and people along the supply chain actually end up influencing the outcomes of the supply chain. So in this report, we categorize the products into 2 groups, drugs and medical devices. And within each group, we actually subdivide them into 2 subgroups. For drugs, we look at originator drugs and generic drugs. And for medical devices, we look into simple medical devices and complex medical devices. The reason that we do this is because each of these subcategories have different types of supply chains, they have different types of market dynamics, different stakeholders, and hence these differentiations imply different types of resiliency measures and concerns. Furthermore, this report does not look at biologics or vaccine supply chains partially because there have been multiple other recent studies from national academies that look at vaccines and how to respond to pandemics. On the other hand, we would like to also mention that some of the recommendations and categorizations that we make in this report actually do apply to vaccines and biologics as well, just because those categories also exhibit similar kind of variation within themselves. So next slide, please. So the two important insights we would like to point out from the get-go are the following. First of all, given the variations in the supply chains and the actors and the market dynamics within the supply chains of different products and different product types, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy for increasing the resilience of supply chains for all medical products. So the key challenge is to match subsets of measures to products in a cost-effective manner. The second insight is that the current medical product classification schemes are based on only clinical importance. And we say that if we're really trying to understand and make decisions for the resiliency within the supply chain for these products, we should also account for shortage risks within these supply chains. So the committee defines the term supply chain critical medical products as those that are both medically essential and vulnerable to shortages because of their supply chains and the risks associated within these supply chains. Next slide, please. As Craig mentioned before, our report does have a chapter that is completely dedicated to the globalization of US medical product supply chains, because as many other products, the US medical product companies have increasingly been sourcing production of products, components, supply of raw materials from locations around the globe. So this globalization comes with some benefits and also drawbacks, of course. So the main benefit is really the lowering of manufacturing costs, which reflects in affordability of drugs. But also we would like to note that increasing globalization is an increase in diversification of certain production facilities, certain suppliers, which ends up increasing the supply chain security. On the other hand, of course, with the drawbacks, one of the main challenges is that as supply chains get globalized, they become longer and harder to the transparency of these supply chains decrease. As the transparency decreases, it becomes harder to regulate and inspect these supply chains. And in fact, that leads into certain quality problems. There are examples of these quality problems partially in the generic sector that have been apparent for decades now, peaking around 2011, getting better, but never really disappearing. So also the lack of transparency leads to impacts around, like not really understanding where products are coming from, which increases the difficulty of assessing supply chain vulnerabilities and hence designing resiliency measures for those. So we would also like to point out that even FDA does not have detailed enough information about global medical product supply chains to enable assessment of vulnerabilities. And I would like to also add that this is sometimes true also for domestic medical product supply chains as well. So these drawbacks have led to a widespread call for onshoring of medical products. However, these calls usually do not actually identify which part of this big and long supply chain to onshore. And usually it sounds like, or it seems like these calls imply the very final assembly stage to be onshored. However, we would like to point out that such an onshoring strategy actually would be very myopic, and it will not actually make the entire supply chain resilient, leaving the supply part or the kind of the earlier parts of the supply chain still vulnerable to disruptions due to the globalization and other types of due to these disruptions that happen or the risks associated with the globalization of the supply chains. We would also like to point out that, on the other hand, if we were thinking about onshoring the entire global supply chain, that would be a daunting logistical task, and usually, expectedly, really coming in with a huge price tag as well. So what we're saying is that onshoring can be part of a cost-effective strategy for increasing resiliency of our medical product supply chains. However, it should be treated as part of a resiliency strategy, but not just the one solution. And furthermore, what we say is that all sorts of resilience strategies, including onshoring, should be evaluated through a framework so that we can end up with coming up with the best strategy for a given set of products that is cost effective and most impactful. And I will be talking about that framework in a second. Thank you. Next slide, please. So before jumping into the framework, I would also like to talk about the three causes or three groups of causes of shortages that the committee has identified. First, there are events that cause a demand surge, which is really an increase of the usage or the demand for a medical product well above the normal level for an extended period of time. So demand surges can be can be the end result of a pandemic or a public health emergency. It could be coming out of as a result of a natural or a man-made disaster, as well as demand surges could be resulting from human or stakeholder behaviors, reactions to supply disruptions such as hoarding and so on. On the second category, we talk about causes of shortages as the capacity reduction, which really describes events that result from this decrease in the production, decrease in the production or transportation capacities of different types of processes. So these could be these kinds of capacity reduction events could be happening due to declines in manufacturing quality, inability to ramp up production, lean inventory management practices that we observe in the industry. There could be regulatory barriers, and again, natural and man-made disasters that result in capacity reduction in either production or transportation. The third category, which we call coordination failure, could be maybe is like one of the unique aspects of this report, which is really saying that we might end up in a shortage situation when we actually have enough supply to meet the demand that exists at that time period. And what we say is that even in those kind of situations, even when we have enough supply to meet the demand, there could be problems in communications or transportation that will prevent sending enough supply to the demand at the right time, to the patients at the right time with the right product, as Craig was mentioning earlier. Such coordination failures could be result of, disruptions in transportation and delivery, as well as geopolitical issues. And what we would like to also emphasize, these could be the result of lack of transparency and information sharing along the supply chain. Next slide, please. So I would like to talk about our framework, and really what I would like you to kind of focus on this picture is the following. We talk about causes, and these can be represented as the trigger events on the left-hand side. And we can imagine that these trigger events, such as a pandemic or a disaster, actually spitting out these red balls. Those are kind of events that will actually end up causing a shortage down the line, perhaps. And what we want to do is we want to build these shields that are our mitigation strategies or categories of our mitigation strategies that will either deflect these red balls or reduce the size of these red balls along this kind of resiliency time horizon, so that by the time if any red ball reaches the humans, the harm is minimized as much as possible. So, so what we would like to do with this framework is the following. We actually created 4 categories of resiliency measures, and we start with the awareness measures, which are at the bottom, because we believe that our awareness, which really is information sharing, it creates the foundation of all the other mitigation, all the other resiliency strategies. So, to summarize, the awareness strategies is a precursor for the other 3 categories and includes measures that provide the information needed to implement them. Next up are the mitigation strategies, which are the first shields that will protect us or protect the society against these trigger events, ending up causing harm. And the mitigation shield includes measures that reduce the extent to which a trigger event results in a supply shortage. Next, preparedness shield. These are measures that reduce the extent to which a supply shortage reaches patients or providers. And then finally, at the response shield, we recognize that at that point, maybe there is a shortage, so the supply is less than the demand. But at the same time, we have impactful response measures so that even though there is a shortage, the harm that is reflected on the society is minimized. And we also would like to, so this is the framework that we will be using to discuss our recommendations in the next phase of our presentation. But before I pass it on to my colleagues here who would discuss the recommendations, I'd like to make a few additional comments. First of all, the way that I've talked about and the way that the report talks about the different categories of resiliency measures is also an indication of what we think are the most effective chronological order of the effectiveness of these measures. So what we say is that in general, using awareness measures, for example, to give supply chain actors information to make better decisions is more efficient than using mitigation measures. And using mitigation measures effectively is actually more effective than using preparedness measures, and so on and so forth. So what we believe is that to act early, to design better, and to share more information as early as possible actually ends up being a more effective, cost-effective strategy that is more impactful when we are thinking about a resilience strategy for a supply chain. Second, I would like to also emphasize the fact that there is a law of diminishing returns for how much we should, or how large we should build or work on a given resilience strategy. So what this means is if we take one resilience strategy, let's say stockpiling for response to an event, if we just take that measure and then build a huge amount of stockpile, it's actually at one point the next unit of inventory you put into that stockpile is not going to be as effective as the first unit that you put in there, because we might not even need that much inventory, or there might not be as much demand. So what we suggest is that instead of building and putting all of our eggs into one basket in terms of thinking about resiliency measures, instead of really concentrating on one measure, we should really be concentrating on a group of measures that will work together to create the best protection from the trigger events going into harm to the society. And finally, I would like to also emphasize the fact that the shortages in medical product supply chains are in part the result of a market failure. So profit motives of manufacturers and vendors motivate a smaller investment in protection than is optimal from a public health perspective. So So our committee's recommendations do include some necessary regulatory components. And however, at the same time, we do try to identify measures and recommendations that are more incentive-based than just regulatory. And then we will, in the next part of this presentation, we will be talking about, my colleagues will be talking about recommendations that are stemming out of this framework. Thank you. Back to you, Craig.
Thank you, Özlem. Next slide, please, Kelsey. As Özlem said, the basis for most of this activity starts with an understanding that we need expanded awareness. Without a database and evidence, we are stuck with guessing what the challenges will be and the vulnerabilities are. So to help explain to you now our specific recommendations with regards to awareness, I turn now to Dr. Fox. Erin, can you talk to us about awareness and then move to mitigation?
Absolutely. All right. Yes, thank you so much. So as Özlem mentioned, the most important step in this framework, and really what we need for the entire framework to work, is actually awareness. And when we talk about awareness, I think it's important to take a step back and think about how opaque the current medical supply chain is. There are absolutely no requirements for transparency to disclose where a product is made, where the key components are made, or even the name of the manufacturer that is actually producing that product. That can be a secret. The end result is that the medical product purchases are made in the dark, basically made on price alone. And not knowing where the key components are made or where in the supply chain we have bottlenecks, that is a public health risk. And not knowing the quality of our products because of these disruptions is also a public health risk. And yes, patients have actually been harmed by delays due to the lack of transparency. It can sometimes take weeks to months to remove contaminated products or recalled products from shelves simply because we don't have the necessary data and the necessary transparency to identify all of the affected products. So this lack of transparency really does hamper efforts to improve the overall resiliency of the supply chain, whether that's the government's ability to work with industry or whether it's third parties working to try to identify the best strategies to improve. Without transparency, we can't do any of this hard work. So I want to talk about three categories of awareness. The first is making data available from both regulators and industry, making that data transparent and available to all. Analyzing and processing that data to make it useful, especially to help identify where the risk points are. And just dumping data doesn't really help people. We actually do need to analyze and process it so that it can be useful information. And then once we have that useful information, we have to communicate the information to those who are responsible and working on the next phases of this framework, those who are working on mitigation, preparedness, and response. Transparency is truly the key to improving the resiliency of the supply chain over time, and improving awareness can happen immediately, and it can also happen over time. So certainly this would take a lot of work, but there are things that we can do in the immediate that could truly make a difference. And the benefits are so many. For example, purchasers can choose to buy from companies that have higher levels of quality and reliability. Policymakers can focus their limited resources on the areas of greatest vulnerability instead of trying to assess the entire supply chain. With the data available, we can pinpoint those products that have the highest risk. And so we have two recommendations regarding awareness. And if we go to the next slide, the first one I want to mention is regarding public transparency. And I want to say that part of the reason prompting this recommendation is that we know that in the United States, we have a pass-fail system. It's either on the market or off the market. It's either FDA approved or not FDA approved. And yet, we know that FDA sees very clear differences between companies and products, but we still only have that pass-fail system. So there's a lot of data behind the scenes that could be used. FDA has proposed multiple times that a quality rating system is needed to improve the resiliency of the supply chain. And that can't happen without data transparency. So recommendation 1 is that the FDA should take steps to make sourcing, quality, volume, and capacity information publicly available for all medical products approved or cleared for sale in the US. And this is going to require that drug manufacturers publicly disclose their manufacturing locations and other data, as well as medical device manufacturers. And then FDA needs to share the information that they have. They have a tremendous amount of data that tells them which products are better and which manufacturers are doing a better job. And of course, all of this truly hinges on Congress making the changes and the necessary amendments to permit the public disclosure of this information. It's not necessarily that FDA wants to keep all of this information hidden. It's that they really truly can't by law disclose it. So we have to have change there. And if we go to the next slide, we can see recommendation 2, which is about the public database that Craig hinted at the beginning of this introduction. So the FDA, in cooperation with other government agencies, should establish a publicly accessible database for supply chain information. And this can be used in a number of different ways, in part to just better understand the vulnerabilities of where we can target the resources to shore up the most vulnerable parts of our supply chain. We can also use these data to track ways to just overall predict the potential medication product shortages via data tracking. And most importantly, we can also involve third-party companies who can help with rating scales and other rating systems for risk and quality that can then be used by end purchasers. And so this actually flows into the next recommendation and the next section that we have, if we go to the next slide, which is mitigation. And so moving straight into mitigation, we have a couple actions to take. So the first is hardening, which actually means taking action to reduce the chance of a disruption within the stages of a supply chain. Or diversification, right? Having parallel versions of manufacturing so that we don't experience product shortages. Both of these things can be done to help try to prevent a shortage from happening. No system is perfect, of course. So there are also things that we can do to overall help this situation and both harden and diversify. So I want to mention that the current structure that we have with an overall lack of transparency and a pass-fail system means that medical product manufacturers have virtually no incentive to do these things and improve the medical supply chain. When purchases are made on cost alone, the incentive is to do the bare minimum and perhaps cut corners and not spend extra money on quality or other strategies that are no longer visible to the people purchasing the products. And at the end of the day, this really leads to a decrease in reliability and quality. And so with the availability of transparency, with public databases, with rating scales, health systems could start to incorporate reliability and quality of products as well as price when they're making purchasing decisions. And this is something that can try to move the market along with purchasers making decisions to favor companies that are choosing to do a good job. And I want to say that, yes, this would cost more, but I also have to say that drug shortages and recalls are already extraordinarily expensive. And so when we're talking about having a good supply versus having to spend a lot of time and money and effort on a shortage, it's worth it. And so if we go to the next slide, we can get to recommendation 3, which is incorporating resilience contracting by health systems. And so what we're talking about here is, again, we have to, this mitigation recommendation cannot happen without the awareness recommendations, of course, but health systems can help promote a more resilient marketplace for medical products by not just purchasing on price alone, when there are data available, when there are rating systems available, those should be used when you're making contracting and purchasing and inventory decisions. And when those quality ratings for medical products are available, accreditation organizations can certainly also assess whether health systems are using those data in their health systems. And they can also assess how often shortages and other supply challenges are affecting health systems and negatively affecting patient care. And so one of the things that health systems can do is whether they're a large system contracting on their own or whether it's a group purchasing organization making contracts for large numbers of hospitals across the country, make sure to award contracts to suppliers that have superior quality and reliability. Award multiple contracts versus single source contracts for that diversification and more reliability. And truly, this marketplace reward can hopefully drive companies to choose to improve their supply chains. And then one last step that health systems can take, if they don't already have it set up, if there's a disaster, say a tornado or a hurricane, then the wholesaler that the health system contracts with should be able to deliver emergency medications to that health system. And so set that up in advance and make sure that you have that. Again, these are mitigation recommendations earlier on, and it's much more efficient and much more cost effective to do these mitigation activities than all the way at the end to response activities where we have a shortage, we're dealing with clinical problems, and that gets a lot more expensive. And so with that, I will turn the time back over to Craig.
Thanks, Erin. Let's go to the next slide, Kelsey. Well, Lee and I, in the next 5 minutes or so, will highlight the preparedness measures that and the response measures that we are recommending, recognizing that preparedness has physical measures and virtual measures. You can discuss inventory stockpiling, and many of you are quite aware of many recommendations that have been brought forward in the past about inventory stockpiling, and we support many of those. Capacity buffering is another approach to deal with that demand surge. And here we're recommending that using fixed cost investments like the Defense Production Act to build production capability that's warm-based and ready to go when we have a demand surge. But there's a second section that requires virtual measures, and that is understanding or doing contingency planning that maps out various scenarios that we may encounter. And again, here, the information that we can get from that database would allow for a more precise understanding of what scenarios we may need to encounter, and then being ready by having capabilities to manage those specific scenarios. Let's go to the next slide and go to the recommendations directly. So with recommendation 4, here we discuss the notion of inventory stockpiling, which is one way of buffering demand surge. And ASPR is really needs to take steps to develop strategies to modernize and optimize inventory and stockpiling management. We believe that there are pre-existing reports that they could turn to that provide significant information and thoughts about those strategies. They need to analyze the risk levels of those supply chain critical medical products, again, dependent on that database, examine key inventory stockpiling processes, and bring into this picture regional and local capabilities under a national plan where things like vendor managed inventory could be managed more effectively and aggressively on a regional or local basis, which would allow for that rotating stock and the VMI, the vendor managed inventory recommendations that have been made in the past. And to accomplish that, we're strongly urging them to convene regional and local working groups to discuss and inform the expectations for what's in that stockpile, what are the terms under which it can be accessed, and developing perhaps a more regional approach to how people can engage in setting those formularies and increasing the accessibility when you have local and regional events, and defining clearly what the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders like the GPOs or the local health distribution supply networks more effectively. Next. Recommendation 5 speaks to not inventory, but capacity buffering. And here ASPR and FDA could work together to cultivate capacity buffering by investing in a variety of activities. One is the analysis of what those crisis price lists might look like for the supply chain critical medical products. ASPR could develop and manage a database of that kind of information for coordinating the surge policies, et cetera. FDA and ASPR should fund research and development in advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing techniques. And here, this investment in these advanced manufacturing techniques may facilitate onshoring of certain parts of the manufacturing process at a lower cost, because these advanced manufacturing technologies may reduce their cost of labor, which is a major concern. And lastly, ASPR should be responsible for assessing disaster demand surge and develop a transparent, unified database across those regional and local environments so that the end users have a much higher understanding of where the investments are going and what their accessibility to these activities and supplies may be. So those preparedness recommendations help to build that shield. Let's go to the next slide, please, Kelsey. And here we're going to talk about response. When you've done your mitigation, you've hardened, you've diversified, you've reduced the impact of a demand surge potentially, then we have, but there's still a surge, we have now given you some ideas about how we can deal with that component of it. But here in the response environment, we're going to focus on that last set of protections in the environment. So let's go to the next slide. So here we can talk about prophylaxis measures, and Lee is going to talk about one aspect of that, demand reduction and supply increase. We are concerned that many product supply chains are global. And Lee, can you talk a bit now about the next recommendation that we have here around how we could address some of the global impact?
Happy to do that, Craig. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So it's the opinion of the committee that supply chains for medical products and drugs are likely to remain highly globalized. The economic forces that have driven supply chains to evolve in that direction are going to continue to push in that direction. And even if the United States manages to shift the final stage of assembly or production for some drugs or medical devices back to the United States, then it's extremely likely that final assembly stage will continue to rely on foreign sources for critical inputs. Right. And so just because you move the last stage of production, into your country does not necessarily buy you, security from, disruption of global supply chains. So given that reality, we argue that major exporters of medical products, including the United States, should negotiate a plurilateral treaty under the aegis of the World Trade Organization that prohibits export bans and trade restrictions on key components of global medical product supply chains, and that any country that violates the terms of this agreement should be subject to sanctions by other signatories. We think that a trade agreement like this is likely to be self-enforcing. Any country that seeks to restrict export of key products or components out of its borders is likely to find itself quite vulnerable to the reaction by its trading partners to restrict its access to key products or components that it does not itself produce. We understand that in a time of global crisis, there can be, a great temptation for political leaders to seem to be doing something positive by disrupting global supply chains in this way. The existence of a treaty, of an international agreement that spells out the rules might be a useful tool in resisting some of this pressure and enabling globalized, efficient supply chains to respond to large demand shocks in the most efficient way possible. Now, we completely understand that this is going to be a difficult undertaking, that given current events, there may be and may not be a lot of diplomatic bandwidth to pursue this recommendation at the moment. But I think what we've learned from the pandemic is that the globe is actually quite vulnerable to the emergence of serious pathogens that can cause major global health crises. This could happen again. We need our global supply chains to be able to respond to these demand shocks in the most efficient way. And happy to take any further questions on this recommendation after the overall presentation concludes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lee. And we're almost done, folks. Let's go to the next slide, Kelsey. So again, at the outset of this, we realized that the last mile and the end users really are the folks on the front line who pay the price for failures in the supply chain. And so we offer a strong recommendation to ASPR in collaboration with the CDC colleagues at HHS to really pull together the key stakeholders to examine and identify the most effective last mile strategies. And again, this is the same theme that I talked about with the stockpile activity, and that is developing a national framework, but empowering greater regional and local involvement in the terms of how we exploit and utilize these mitigation, preparedness, and response steps that we've described to you. Importantly, we believe there should be a national ethical framework for allocating scarce medical products. And we've learned a lot in the last couple of years about how we can do that. So development of response plans and training for medical product shortages is also a lacking reality. And we believe that public health and healthcare professionals really need to be educated and trained around this set of issues. Next slide, Kelsey. Next slide. The 7 recommendations we think will improve supply reliability. Next slide. And the summary is, it begins with awareness, transparency in the database. Without data and evidence, it's almost impossible to rationally approach the notion of how we're going to mitigate, prepare, and respond to these activities. So we hope that that is clear as you go through the body of this document. Next slide. And today is our public release day. So Stephanie, I'm going to turn back to you and have you coordinate discussion with our participants around the questions that they've been raising. Thank you very much.
That's excellent. Thank you all. And for those of you who asked, just a reminder, if you would like to download a full PDF of the report, go to nationalacademies.org/supply chain resilience. You'll find the report, and within the next week, the recording of this webinar and slides will be posted there too. So our first question for the committee, this has to do with the workforce at every stage of the supply chain. Given that workers in critical stages and facilities are often deemed essential, what happens if they have to be on sick leave? What happens if they have to quarantine? Does this report consider plans to protect essential workers?
Well, as you recall, and I'm going to turn to Aslam to answer this more definitively, but as you recall, when we talked about the causes of supply chain disruption, part of that causality, those 3 major causes, include such things as the unavailability of staff to produce that quality product. Aslam, would you care to comment further about that?
So Craig, I think you're absolutely right. We do categorize resource shortages, including human resources, in capacity reductions as a cause. However, we do not have a recommendation that particularly addresses a human resources issue, but many of the recommendations, such as the stockpiling and others will, like if that's done right, it should be able to address capacity reduction issues that could also be caused by human resources as well. But I do also want to acknowledge that there are human resource issues all the way throughout the supply chain, all the way to the last mile.
Thank you. The next question deals with product expiration. So who sets the expiration dates of equipment or medications? Did your report discuss ways to prevent product expiration, and in what instances it may be appropriate to permit use beyond the expiration date?
Certainly, this goes to the inventory component as well as hardening. But I'm going to turn to Erin to comment on that more directly. She has ongoing experience with this particular challenge.
Sure. So one of the things to think about is that the manufacturers are completely in charge of setting expiration dates, and they have to provide that data to FDA. If they want to extend an expiration date, FDA has an amazing table of expiration dates that have been extended, but it depends on the company to provide the data to the FDA. The FDA can't do it on their own. They also can't do it from private studies. It has to be from industry. And using products past their expiration date gets tricky, especially as many states prohibit that and kind of think of that as illegal activity for some licensed folks.
Yeah, I would further comment that, as many of you may know, the Defense Department does have a specific waiver authority with regards to stockpiling, which now has been extended to some products within the civilian stockpile to extend those expiry dates. And that's very useful, and we would propose that that should continue where it's rational and reasonable.
Thank you. As for transparency and information sharing, are there any differences in how different individuals or stakeholders across the medical product supply chain would process and use that information? Does the report also provide any strategy for taking behavioral differences into account in using information?
Well, that is a bit of a complex question. But having said that, I think that we believe that the manufacturers have primary concerns about business protection and those kinds of issues. And as part of our discussion, we've looked at various models for how that information can be transparent, but at the same time offer protections for those concerns that people have. And behaviorally, I think most people are driven by the concerns that they have that their secret sauce would be exposed and they would lose their competitiveness. Oslam, would you want to comment about that?
Sure. Maybe I have two additional things to say, Craig. I completely agree what you said. So the committee has discussed behavioral issues. As we pointed out, like we do agree that behavioral trends or behavioral aspects of the supply chain really do impact the outcomes. So as with the manufacturers, we also discuss hoarding issues at at different stages of the supply chain and how that impacts the supply chain. I also want to mention that one of our measures, awareness measures, also includes a recommendation around analysis. So this analysis should include not only the data and the supply chain structure, but the types of behaviors and the impact of those behaviors on the supply chain outcomes. So we do not have a solution to this, but we do believe that it is very important, and these behavioral components should be part of these analysis. And if I can add one more thing, and we do talk about incentives. So we do believe that both regulation and incentives should be considered as part of resilience strategies because they directly impact the behavior.
Yeah, as Erin mentioned in her presentation, we believe that there is a built-in incentive where you can demonstrate your quality and reliability. You have a market incentive to present that data, because that speaks to the why your product is a more desirable product for people to buy and invest in. So we think there are some built-in potential incentives here where quality and reliability become more transparent.
Going back to your recommendation for a working group, when formulating that recommendation, did the committee consider how to engage, collaborate, or partner with other communities beyond the medical supply or delivery ones? For example, trucking, road, weather, or defense logistics. This person says these transportation issues may not be under the jurisdiction, control, or even culture of medical supply communities, but they could certainly make or break supply chain resilience.
Yeah, certainly. And and I think our recommendation is that this really should be a whole of community set of activities. In the disaster response environment, we have these support functions for transportation, energy, et cetera, et cetera. We believe that that linkage between the dependency relationships that health has on transportation, public safety, energy, et cetera, should be emulated again as you go through this planning process and you explore what's available, what the limitations are, what should be in there. All those issues really need the whole of community analysis where people understand their dependency relationships among them. You can't have a hospital disaster response without considering, is trucking functional? Is public safety going to protect us? We closed hospitals in New Orleans and Katrina, not because they were flooded, but because they were under threat. So, all these things have to play together. So our recommendation really accounts for the notion that it should be a whole of community activity that recognizes the parts, the roles, and the responsibilities that are played across the community to support this.
Thank you. Has there been discussion about keeping products with lower quality scores on the market? One fear is purchasers will stop buying these products and they may cease manufacture. How do we improve the quality of those products on manufacturers rather than discouraging them from investing further or dropping out of the market entirely?
Aslam, would you like to answer that, or Aaron? Maybe Aslam first and then Aaron.
I would actually fall back on Aaron on that. Aaron, do you mind taking it first?
Sure. So, of course, the idea isn't to discourage suppliers, but the hope is that if manufacturers are incentivized, perhaps by being able to charge higher prices, they will improve their quality. And so if a manufacturer really has poor quality, do we want that on the market? I don't think so. Lower quality products are higher risk for supply disruptions and recalls and all of those things that get us to the end of this framework in the response phase. And so by paying more, incentivizing manufacturers to improve quality through marketplace solutions, I think the idea is that we will have more resilience in the supply chain rather than reduced.
Thank you. We're almost at the end of our time. So I have a few questions in this vein. I'll try to combine them. Can you talk more about the role of group purchasing organizations in the supply chain, given their purchasing power and often hospitals are beholden to their offerings? And how do we, going back to your presentation, how do we move past cost alone and toward reliability?
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that, and then maybe Aaron could discuss a little further. But I think that the GPOs, and there are a variety of kinds of things called GPOs. Okay, we talk about McKesson and Robbins and so on, but there are hospitals that have banded together not only to buy, but also to distribute so that they have the distribution package in their own control more. Health Trust comes to mind, where 1,600 hospitals use that system. Our view is that they should be critical players in these regional and local discussions, as well as in the national discussions. so that they are actively engaged in that regional and local discussion around how we're going to approach negotiating emergency pricing, crisis price lists, and that sort of thing on a regional and local basis, as well as how they could play to facilitate decentralized supply chain capability under that national plan, using their capabilities to have inventory stockpiling available to them. Erin, do you want to comment further about GPO roles?
Yeah, no, I think what you said is great. I think the other item there is anyone contracting. So if it's a GPO making a contract, to consider those other factors of reliability and quality, and not just price alone. So certainly they're definitely part of this solution.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and I do apologize, we are a little after noon. We had a little over 200 folks join today, so I apologize if we didn't get to every single question. But once you exit this webinar, you will be redirected to our report page where you could download the report itself, a summary, press release, and a bunch of other handy materials, and you could certainly follow up with us if you have any questions. So thank you again to all of our speakers, and thanks to our audience for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.